Okay, so hi, I'm Roni Dover. I'm a software architect at Quali. We create sandboxes, and if you visited our booth, then maybe by now you know a little bit about what sandboxes are, and if not, then I guarantee by the end of this lecture you will. And I'm here to talk about production in a box, or why you should put your production in a box to let other people play with. But I'm going to start with a short story about Pushkin. And I'm not actually talking about Alexander Pushkin, the well-known Russian author and poet. I'm actually talking about my dog, Pushkin, who taught me a lot about testing, and I want to tell you why. So Pushkin we adopted Pushkin something like 9 years ago. And fortunately, he was very well behaved and extended his hand when we asked him to and sat down when we asked him to. And he was, just very adorable, except. So there were a few exceptions. So apparently, Pushkin was completely well-behaved, except when there were a lot of people around, or guests over with food, or if there was a cat in the vicinity, or a dog, and somehow the scarier the dog, the more he wanted to pick a fight with him, with me also in the background. And so, first instinct, we thought, okay, the dog is broken, need to return the dog. It's malfunctioning. And then, after a while, we decided maybe it's best to first consult with a dog trainer. And the dog trainer actually had a pretty interesting idea. So he told me, look, the problem is when something bad happens, when your dog starts jumping at the food on the table when there are guests over, or tries to gets panicked when there are a lot of kids in the room or something like that, it's already too late. Because you're not expecting it, you're not in control, you're maybe busy with the dishes or doing some other thing. You can't apply the corrective action that you need to. So he said, look, try to simulate things first. Try to create maybe a simulated environment where you can actually test it out. Let's say invite the neighbor's daughter with some cookies and see how the dog reacts to that. Walk by a cat, which is when the dog is completely leashed, and see how he reacts. So do all of these simulated scenarios in order to apply corrective action and teach your dog how to behave not under ideal hypothetical conditions, because when I was holding a snack or a treat in my hand, the dog would roll over, do acrobatics, do everything. But when that was not the case, the dog was misbehaving. So this was something like 9 years ago, and then 8 years ago, I was practicing TDD. And I was writing a lot of unit tests. And much like my dog, Pushkin, my code in unit tests was always behaving. So in unit tests, in the hypothetical unit testing world, I ran all of the code validation, and it seemed to work perfectly. However, when there were people or users nearby, and when the conditions became less than ideal, then I found that the unit testing did not quite provide me with the feedback that I needed, right? So, to my surprise, in recent years, I found that the dog trainer that gave me all this good advice can actually be considered an agile coach, because the entire ecosystem which has really started with this, right, with this diagram where you have your dev and CI which run unit tests, and then you try to push to production and maybe fail, maybe succeed. So the entire ecosystem is moving right. And by saying moving right, I mean that more and more of CI becomes around emulating those conditions so that the CI can assume responsibility over continuous delivery as well, which is where pipelines come in, right? So The pipelines provide you with the stages to continually deliver, but also to continually test prior to delivery so that it's not a roulette, right? It's not some wild gambit every time you push the build button. You actually need to make all of those testing prior to pushing. You want to continuously integrate in order to be able to continuously deploy. Okay? So, whereas before in the CI, when we didn't have CD, unit testing were more than enough, maybe. Now we need actually a spectrum of tests. So, as you can see, our unit tests are actually replaced by a whole multitude of different types of tests in order to ensure that when we deploy, things work out as expected, in order to really dog train our code. So we have UI tests and performance tests and security tests, and we want to pre-test the deployment, and we want to run all sorts of validations that are more real-life and less imaginary than the unit tests. Now, the problem is this, that unit tests are pretty easy. Anybody can run them. You need a laptop and maybe a CI agent of Jenkins or any other CI tools, and the unit test can run. But when I tried to simulate real-life conditions with my production deployment, then I needed to create production-like environments with multiple cloud resources, maybe PaaS services that I depend on, config management, load balancing, CDN, a lot of different components that were, you could script them all, but it was not that easy anymore. So if I sort of try to break it into different components, then we have some sort of code that deploys my application in this simulated environment. And then we have the application configuration and dependencies, and then the underlying infrastructure, network compute, security, because all of that is something that I want to test. So to create this little holodeck, we need to take care of all of those components. And this little simulation is what we call a sandbox. But here's the problem. It's complicated, right? It sounds complicated. And this is a slide that somebody who's called Gojo Adzik, I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly, he's a great guy, has some very interesting lectures wrote about different types of tests. And the way he puts it, tests cost you in terms of maintenance, and they provide benefit in terms of detecting risk. But the more costly the test maintenance, the more costly it is to develop. Your DevOps cycle will become slower because the cost of change of making adjustment to your tests every time, let's say, you update your production environment, starts to bear you down. So how do we handle that? How do we make it easy to run tests that depend on a very complicated setup? So the problem is that it's complicated and that it's hard to maintain, but here's the thing. Most of you, this thing that I showed you here, you're already doing it. Right? So you're doing it because you have a production environment, and you're continually pushing to production, either manually or in an automated way. So you've already figured out some of these pieces. So can we maybe take those assets, those scripts that configure our app, those the deployment code, how we map the app to the infrastructure, and really single source, take that code from production, and I don't mean like in this example, put it on a floppy disk. I mean, put it in a one source, in source control, and then use that in other places as well. So just sidetracking here, the assumption here that most production environments should have repeatable automation. This is something that it's very important to get to anyway. And the reason for that is that, and I've seen a lot of cases where this is true, if we don't have repeatable automation, then a lot of times the reason our production works is because somebody ran some deployment configurations and then he made a change. So he made a slight tweak to make it work, but now nobody else knows how to put that hole in the wall next time we deploy production, and it will fail. So we should test this, right? We should test that this doesn't exist. We should test that when we deploy our code in production with the repeatable automation that I was talking about, we should test that it works, which is why we need a sandbox. And if we do have that, then the task of deploying to production is not something you'll dread, right? It's not something where it will be very risky with a lot of, let's say, trepidation before you start. So end of sidetrack, I'm sorry. This was just an assumption I was making. So we said that we have some sort of a way to get our code to production, and we've already figured out some of these assets, but we need to make it smarter. So the challenge is that we need to take that code and to make it relevant or applicable not just to deploying to production, but to other stages of the DevOps, to other stages in our pipeline. So what does that entail? So for once, it would be great if we could integrate this into our pipeline using multiple clouds. So AWS or Azure or a Google Cloud Platform or our internal data center might be great for production, but testing on Kubernetes for some of these scenarios might be much easier, much faster, or using any other Docker framework. The other aspect is that whereas we're talking about production, we don't always need everything in production all of the time. So we want to decouple the app from the infrastructure as much as possible. We want to make it possible to take this code and to say, okay, my application in production is maybe a cluster of different nodes with a load balancer and a lot of other logic around it, and maybe for some tests, this is exactly what I need, but for other tests, I just need to put everything on a single VM because that part of the infrastructure is not what I'll test something else. So, and a bad example, by the way, of that is most of the cloud providers, their own format usually binds these things together. So if you've ever used a CloudFormation or an Azure Resource Management template, you'll see that a lot of times it couples very closely the type of infrastructure you'll be running your app and how to configure your app in the same file. So making changes to that is difficult. So it's not a matter of parameters only, saying, look, this is the configuration, now run that on 2 nodes, run that on a single node, change the hardware spec. It becomes big changes that you need to make to your entire configuration. So if we do have that, if we do create these sandboxes that can be parameterized, that allow us to deploy to any infrastructure, they could become self-service. So they could become something that is a commodity that you can use anywhere in your organization, and not just testing. So basically, you have, once you define how to create an environment and deploy, it becomes easy to have a replica of production of some sort of either completely simulated or not simulated at all feature branch in your code suddenly becomes its own production. Then, first of all, production becomes less important and less something that's treated with reference. And also, it becomes something very useful in the organization. So I'll give you an example, and beyond testing. So development environments, for example. So one thing is that development environments are no longer just a laptop and an IDE as they used to. And a lot of times, and I've seen a lot of examples for this, you would want, as a part of your dev environment, to have maybe some services running in the cloud, or some services that you depend on that are not, that you can't even put on your laptop, or that your laptop isn't strong enough to run. And the other thing that, another assumption I'm making is that DevOps doesn't mean that all users are not responsible for ops. And sometimes it sounds like that, but DevOps still means that there is some sort of a dedicated knowledge, because development teams, the DevOps team shouldn't need to debug any issue because some developer tried to create his own environment and did it in a non-standard way. So within DevOps, everything should be automated, some services provisioned in the cloud, and there is some sort of value in being able to deliver a working environment, even for development, with some production-like services, maybe with the latest database copy of production on them, so that you can work off it. And the flip side of that is that if you do have a lot of developers and each is improvising their own environment, then you get a lot of instabilities. So in your dev, You want better feedback. So wouldn't it be great if, for example, you were able to provision these sandboxes for dev, and you wouldn't have to wait until you check in your code to get feedback about whether the Selenium tests are running or about whether your app meets the latest security standards. So in your sandbox that you created for your dev environment, tests and other assets down the pipeline could become a resource that you consume, a service, so to speak, that's available to you even early in the development cycle. So to summarize, things are moving right. You need to continuously integrate, to continuously deploy. Creating your personal production in a box is a sandbox. And in that sandbox, it's important to have a single source-controlled, repeatable automation building blocks that you can use across the DevOps cycle. And this will actually make the DevOps cycle faster, more reliable, with higher quality. You want to break the coupling between the app and the infra to make sure that what you have is flexible enough and that the cost of change whenever you change your test, whenever you change your environment doesn't mean you have to rewrite your entire test suite. And you have to make your sandbox environments self-service. So my takeaway is, first of all, continuously integrate. And when I say integrate is take any, and I think, by the way, that term has been a lot of time sort of misinterpreted, because when people say CI, they often mean unit tests, which isn't the same thing. The end goal that we have with CI is actually to reduce the risk by integrating often with anything that is outside our control or outside of our code. If it's integrating with the browser, if it's integrating with the network topology and the security groups that will actually be used, if it's integrating with the web server and its configuration, it's basically integrated with everything. So continuously integrate, don't just write unit tests. Build sandboxes. Don't forget to destroy them too. Thank you.